So firstly, welcome everyone to the inaugural webinar of this IEA Southeast Asia Nuclear Dialogues series. We appreciate you taking an hour of your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. The IEA chose to establish its first office outside of the Paris headquarters in the Southeast Asia region here in Singapore, in recognition of this region's key role in driving a lot of the global energy trends. And over the last 6 months, since the Regional Cooperation Center has been established, we've had the fortune to visit most of the Southeast Asian countries, with a few more to go over the next few months, to meet with the government stakeholders, as well as a lot of the industry, finance, multilateral, academics, and other think tanks in each of the countries that we visited. And one of the things that we noticed as part of the nation's consideration of how they can manage the growth of energy demand that is coming into the region and into each of these countries, as well as find the right balance of diversifying the energy supply sources, the role of nuclear has really become part of the consideration of the energy mixes and power development plans and energy plans for several of the countries in the region. And this is why the IEA, in collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency, other players in the region like the ASEAN Center for Energy, area, and other stakeholders, have really developed this set of webinars to examine the role of nuclear in Southeast Asia. We want to emphasize that this is the start of the dialogue. We really are trying to build a community of engaged stakeholders in this space, and we will roll out a few more webinars in the coming months. But this first webinar really is a sort of scene setter. It will provide a very data-driven overview of nuclear energy globally and in Southeast Asia region. We're very fortunate to have Brent Wanner, who is the IEA head of the Power Sector Unit and one of the lead authors of the IEA report, which we released in January, which is the Path to a New Era for Nuclear Energy. Join us today to go through this kickoff webinar. So before we start, though, just a few housekeeping matters. So firstly, thank you to those of you who have already filled in the Menti, which is a really important way for us to guide and understand where your interest levels are. We have popped the details for the Menti into the chat as well. So please do take a minute to fill that in as well, because it will give us some good steer and guidance. The second thing is that please do feel free to put your questions into the chat box in the Zoom feature. We will leave time for questions at the end, and Brent and Philippe will do their best to make sure that we get through as many of them as possible. And then finally, you will notice that we are recording this webinar. We will post it on the IEA website so that people can have access to it who are not able to join today. And along on that website, we'll also put details of upcoming webinars from there. So that's enough for me. I'm now going to hand over to Brent. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining once again.
Thanks, Suarn, and welcome, everyone. And good to see everyone this morning and this afternoon. So morning from Paris. So today I would want to go through, as Suarn mentioned, this is very much focused on the recent developments and prospects for nuclear power in Southeast Asia. So we've organized the material into kind of 3 parts, is to look at the status of nuclear power from a very global perspective, so across countries around the world, then zoom in on Southeast Asia and some of the policies in particular there. And also then the third part is to look at the overall timelines and costs for nuclear energy as we understand and see them today, again, based on the information and evidence in the world today. So let me share my screen. Should be here. Okay, so I would like to take about 30 minutes or so, a little bit to highlight some of these foundational elements to help establish, and exactly as Suarn said, to set the scene for also this dialogue series and the opportunities for nuclear power in general. A lot of this information is coming from our recent report that was published in January this year, The Path to a New Era for Nuclear Energy, which was the International Energy Agency, was our third special report on nuclear power in the last 6 years. So, which is an accelerated rhythm of focus on nuclear power, as we see that there is now a comeback for nuclear power in general, and so the interest in the topic is growing and growing. So we start at the status globally. The first place to start is to say that nuclear power is already the second largest source of low emissions electricity in the world today. It's behind only hydropower at the global level, and that was in 2024. We see the generation totals here for the world. So just over 2,800 terawatt hours from nuclear power. That's from over 410 operating reactors around the world in over 30 countries. And that total means that nuclear power is producing more electricity than wind power globally, more electricity than solar power globally. And each year is helping to avoid about 1.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. That means in place of coal-fired power, of natural gas-fired power, and oil-fired power, nuclear power has long been a part of the system. For over 60 years has been a part of energy systems around the world. But today, this is often forgotten, but as a starting point, is producing a significant amount of electricity worldwide. Of course, that is not the same everywhere. So globally, nuclear is producing about 10% of electricity each year. Over the last decade, that number has been quite stable. But when we look across regions, there are different trends occurring for nuclear power. In advanced economies, there was actually a peak for the share of nuclear energy and the role of nuclear energy more than about 25 years ago in the late 1990s, when nuclear power was providing more than a third of electricity in Europe, close to a third in Japan, and close to 20% in the United States, and at the time, much lower shares in Russia and China. As we move forward in time and bring it up to date, the share of nuclear power in Europe, in the European Union, has declined quite significantly, which the executive director of the IEA, Dr. Fatih Birol, has identified as one of the key mistakes within Europe in strategy over the past several decades, as this is a major missed opportunity for maintaining the role of nuclear power. In Japan, of course, there was an unfortunate accident at Fukushima Daiichi in 2011, following which the role of nuclear output fell to zero, but has since recovered and is now close to 10% of generation. In the United States, it's been more stable, but in Russia and China and other emerging markets, the share of nuclear has been growing over time. And as I said, that means globally, the amount, so the share and the role of nuclear energy has been relatively stable at around 10% for more than the last decade. If we look into individual countries, taking data from 2023, which is the International Energy Agency, we spend a lot of effort to collect and harmonize data for the entire energy system, including nuclear power, including for electricity systems. If we list here more than top 20 countries in terms of their share of nuclear power in the system, we see that there's as high over 60% in France and the Slovak Republic in Europe. And longtime leaders here, we see many of those with a high share of nuclear power. In total, you have about close to 10 countries that just over 10 countries that get 1/3 of their electricity from nuclear power. And here I've identified where advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies are in this balance. And I would also highlight particularly that these are mainly countries that have had nuclear power for many years, for decades. But it's not only. So you have the United Arab Emirates here, which is producing about 20% of its electricity, and this is rising actually today from nuclear power, and it's very much a newcomer to the nuclear space. It did not have nuclear power just a decade ago, and so has been producing. Here we see is in the top 20 in the world in terms of nuclear producers, a major success story in terms of growth. I'm happy to come back to that example possibly in questions, because it serves as a good example of how fast things can go. But just to say, that process there has taken about 15 years from the decision to have nuclear power to the state we are today, and having the first reactors and producing now a significant portion of electricity. One of the reasons we see for optimism in nuclear making a comeback in many ways is the construction activity that's ongoing around the world. Now here showing as of December 2024, where nuclear reactors were under construction. We see very clearly that China is by far the largest, by far in the lead, and has the most nuclear capacity under construction, about half of the global total. And here we've also split between whether the designs of the nuclear reactors are Chinese designs, Russian designs, or from other providers. Because what we've seen recently is that China and Russia have dominated the design aspect across the nuclear space. Korea, Japan, the United States are also providers of nuclear technologies and nuclear building, but this is a much smaller share today. In the last 8 years, Chinese and Russian designs have accounted for more than 80% of new reactor construction starts. So we have a robust level of construction, which is one of the highest levels in the last 30 years. We also have technology innovation going on, and I'll talk more about small modular reactors in a moment. And we're also at a point where we have more countries pursuing and have clear plans and policies for nuclear than ever before. So there's over 40 countries in the world with plans to expand the role of nuclear. And again, today there are just over 30 that are operating nuclear. So this is including 10 countries that don't yet have nuclear power in operation. When we look forward then, and a lot of our work here at the IEA and within the World Energy Outlook in particular, gives the long-term view out to 2050, including the role of nuclear energy, where we highlight, when we look at across countries and across plans and policies, we see that when we put this all together, if countries are able to deliver on those plans, we'll see a doubling of nuclear power by 2050 in total in terms of gigawatts around the world. Now, this is partly, we've divided here in terms of how they will meet this. One important aspect is extending the life of existing reactors. Again, this is largely in those long-time leader countries, the United States, Japan, France. That's an important aspect and one of the most cost-effective options we see. It's building new large reactors, which is the majority of new construction, because there are several commercial designs available. But then it's also small modular reactors, or SMRs. And we see that coming very much in the near term, the first reactors around 2030, and a wave of reactors being built in the 2030s and 40s, and so becoming a significant portion of the global fleet. Now, to say this can look quite strong growth for nuclear in capacity terms, but to keep in mind that this actually really just maintains the share and the role of nuclear power overall. So again, today, nuclear power is close to 10%, and even with this doubling of nuclear power, this is actually slower growth than the overall electricity demand growth globally. So that share actually slightly declines over time towards 8% of global electricity generation. So to keep up with that growth will be a major task for any technology, even just to maintain its share. Thinking of the relative place of nuclear power compared with other technologies and other power technologies in terms of growth, and what we see, this is looking over the next 15 years to 2040. it's very clear that solar and wind are set to expand the most in terms of capacity. Of course, this is not generation, and so the amount of electricity output from solar PV and wind would be less per unit of capacity than nuclear power or coal or natural gas. But here we see those are the main areas of growth, complemented by continued growth for natural gas, nuclear, and coal capacity. Of course, there are other renewable technologies like bioenergy, geothermal that are also growing, but these are the 5 largest sources of electricity that are growing over the next 15 years. And we see nuclear's place there is a complementary role alongside other technologies. But then if we shift to Southeast Asia, and particularly to highlight a bit of the policy and getting going in Southeast Asia, and very much the topic of this dialogue series, I think the first thing to say, there are not operating reactors in Southeast Asia, but there are policies and plans to build out reactors here. So particularly 3 countries with policies in place in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam. Highlighted here, this is focusing on Indonesia. Well, in Indonesia, we see targets to build out the first nuclear capacity in the mid-2030s. The Philippines has set longer-term targets, so 2032 targets, as well as longer-term targets for 2050. And in Vietnam, recently, the updates of the Adjusted Power Development Plan, Power Development Plan 8, have set a target for the long term for 2050 between 10.5 and 14 gigawatts. So there are substantial ambitions in the region. We have worked closely with these countries in the past. In Indonesia, we've worked with directly on a net zero roadmap. We continue to work with PLN, the main utility in Indonesia, on long-term planning. We've also worked closely with Vietnam. I'm very happy that we've recently signed a memorandum of agreement to work together more closely. We've had a recent net zero roadmap for the electricity sector for Vietnam, in which also nuclear power featured there. We should also say that there are review processes and discussions going on in many more countries in Southeast Asia. So very much we've seen that the IAEA review process has been ongoing in Malaysia and Thailand, and there are now also active discussions in Singapore about the use of nuclear power. So certainly the interest in the region is high, and that's one of the motivating factors for this series, and particularly on the small modular reactor side. And to say, to put those targets and plans kind of in context, if those policies are delivered, we would see something between 20 and 30 gigawatts of nuclear power in Southeast Asia in the longer term, which would translate to up to 200 terawatt hours of electricity generation annually, which would mean that those new nuclear reactors would meet up to 7% of electricity demand growth over the next 25 years, which is a significant amount because the amount of electricity demand growth in Southeast Asia is very strong as the economies are growing and developing. Now, this would be the equivalent of up to 40 gigawatts of coal-fired power at today's operations, up to 160 gigawatts of solar, and close to 100 gigawatts of wind would be the equivalent of that 20 or 30 gigawatts of nuclear power. And of course, nuclear power is also a 24/7, round-the-clock source of electricity. So it also provides grid stability, can be available at all times, which is an advantage in power systems in helping to ensure reliability around the clock. I think one other point here I wanted to make was on this market leadership, where the technology providers for nuclear power, what we've seen in the last 8 years, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of new construction starts around the world were Chinese or Russian designs. And we see here really just more than 10% outside of China and Russia. But as we move forward, because of plans and policies and also the industry developing, we see this becoming a more diverse market. versus marketplace of providers. So while China and Russia continue to provide the technology and continue to build, there's also an increasing presence in the overall nuclear market for the United States or companies in Europe, as well as Korea, Japan, in terms of providers. So I think this is an important point that we are moving, let's say, back to a more diverse set of technology providers. This is a picture that actually is closer to what we've had in the past. But again, there are very active developments on the technology in many countries around the world. And so it's, if we take just a narrow view of the recent past, we can see a more concentrated portion, but we think that is a temporary situation. Then I would move into the last section on timelines and costs for nuclear development, focusing very much on observations we've seen in the recent past in the market, and then some of our expectations going forward. A place to start, which is very prominent in the media, is that there have been a challenge in developing new reactors, particularly in the United States and Europe, new large reactors in the last decade, where new projects have been significantly delayed and over budget. So here showing the light blue dots are the original plans for both the timeline, which you can read the years along the bottom axis, and the initial cost per kilowatt along the vertical axis. So on average, most projects were planned to be constructed in 5 years and cost between as low as $2,000 per kilowatt or even up to $9,000 per kilowatt for recent projects, but most between $2,000 and $6,000 per kilowatt, which then makes these, because these are gigawatt scale projects, makes these in the range of $2 to $8 billion projects. So for a single large reactor, that's kind of total cost range. But what we've seen is that, and observed here, is there have been significant delays. So on average, in the US and Europe, those large projects have been 8 years delayed and cost 2.5 times more than the initial cost. But this is important to understand why this has happened. So a few of the key factors are that these were first-of-a-kind reactors. So moving to an EPR reactor in Europe, AP1000 design in the US. And so first-of-a-kind projects are always more complicated and can be delayed. But on top of that, there was also these projects mainly started before 2011 and before the accident at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan. So that there were additional, so many of these projects had to go back and re-engineer or redesign certain elements. And so there were additional regulatory measures, additional safety measures put in place that the projects had to pause and to partly redesign. And that was a significant factor in the longer term here for these delays. So something we don't expect this kind of timeline or this level of cost to be repeated. That's very important to note here, but it's also not every project was affected the same way. Noting two in particular here that were built, one in Korea, this project Seoul 1 and 2, these two reactors were delayed in time, but the costs did not increase as significantly. And also the projects Baraka 1 through 4 in the United Arab Emirates, which was built in partnership with the technology provided by Korea, by a Korean company. And so their design, again, built with less than 10 years, and the cost increases were less. But we see here also that the experience for each reactor varies quite a lot because of the regulatory environment, because of the design choices, and because of the external factors. So this is, just wanted to very much in people's mind at first. And we recognize that this is a significant challenge, that projects need to be delivered on time and on budget. Now, on the other hand, at the same time, in the last 2 decades, not all projects have been delayed as extensively. And there have been actually quite a few projects that have been built in as little as 5 years. We look in China and projects built with Russian designs, over the last 10 reactors built in both cases here, we can see the timelines can be significantly shorter. So several of the reactors in China have been built in 5 years, though in one case, one of the last 10 was built in 9 years. So you're in this range of 5 to 9 years in China. Russian designs have been as short as 5 years. One reactor was built that quickly, but most were 6 or 7 years, and one reactor took significantly longer to finish. That was also a new design. So I think to reinforce that there is quite a range of experience, but 5 years is certainly the minimum we've seen for any new reactors built in recent times. And experience here helps drive down and shorten those construction times. So repeating a design and building it again in a series effect can also help shorten these timelines. But the first of a kind reactor or the first reactor in a country tend to be longer periods. If we then, there's kind of a lot going on in this figure, but nuclear is in the middle with what we anticipate as typical development times, and also comparing to other technologies. I just wanted to highlight here that amongst low emission technologies, amongst other technologies, nuclear tends to be the longest construction period, even amongst certainly longer than solar PV or wind, but also longer than coal-fired power or natural gas turbines. So it takes a longer period of construction, but also a longer period of planning ahead of time. So the nuclear construction periods, which can be up to a decade or longer, this is more in line with large transmission projects that we see, but is much longer than other power plants. A bit more on this development time, and also getting into one of the promises of small modular reactors is for a large new build. This gives a sense of, in this new report, we focused also a lot on the financing side. And one of the challenges for large-scale nuclear reactors is this extensive development and construction time, which then means the time to earning revenues and to starting to pay back on financing can be quite significant. So I mentioned this 10-year is a very common sort of pre-project, pre-construction period of planning, and then a 10-year construction process means that from the time of deciding to build nuclear can be up to 20 years, or is often 20 years. I mentioned the United Arab Emirates earlier. That was one of the shortest timelines, where from that pre-project, from the decision point to the first reactor, was about 14 years, and was one of the shorter periods that we've seen, that we've observed in the past. And then this means that even with solid revenue streams, this means that a break-even point would be 30 years after the point of initial decision to build out nuclear. Now, small modular reactors, so for large reactors, now these timelines as shown are not the same in every project in every region, but I think the point to make here is that these timelines are significantly longer. Small modular reactors, the aim is for them to be built more in a factory setting, able to build more off-site. Today, about 2/3 of large reactors themselves are built on the site itself, which raises challenges for timelines and actually the building, the construction process. Where small modular reactors, the aim is to build more in a factory controlled setting and shorten those timelines, and to standardize those designs where the pre-project and pre-construction can be significantly shorter, and the construction period can be shorter, can be 5 years or less is the aim, which can then also bring the break-even point in terms of financing and cash flow. That can bring that forward 10 years or more, which would be a significant change on the financing side, would also increase interest from private capital, but ultimately this could reduce the risk profile for nuclear investments and could also bring them to market faster. So this is one of the promises of SMRs, but to kind of bring back to where we are today, we should note that there are only a handful of operating small modular reactors in the world. They are in China and in Russia. and they are not the commercial designs that are anticipated to be the most prominent in the market in the years ahead. So in the report itself, we highlighted about more than 10 of the key designs and companies that are developing small modular reactors, by which I mean 300 megawatts or less is sort of a standard size, where a large reactor is 1,000 megawatts or larger. We see that around 2030 will be the first commercial reactors, and then we see a second wave and a wave of projects coming in the mid-2030s to bring SMRs to market. And here we've highlighted where we see the most promising markets. China is pursuing 3 separate designs for SMRs and moving quickly, and we've seen the construction process and timelines there can be a bit shorter. So anticipate China being having the most SMRs in terms of capacity. The United States is pursuing many designs. There are quite a few companies pursuing, and we've seen very strong interest from artificial intelligence and technology companies that are looking for round-the-clock power, looking for a stable source of electricity to power data centers, and there are already plans and interest in building 25 gigawatts of SMRs just for technology companies in the United States. And so this is a big driver we see with policies changing in the United States for supporting SMR development. In Europe, the European Union, there are several countries, and many countries have now named SMRs in their policies and plans. We see a number of these going forward in the future to provide electricity in particular. In India, there's a policy to develop SMRs focusing on decarbonizing the industry sector, and the United Kingdom has named SMRs among their overall energy security plan as a way. So I think this is also to give a sense that the purpose of building out SMRs and nuclear reactors can be, of course, meeting demand growth, but also reducing emissions from electricity, but also from heat, industry, and other applications. If all of this is developed, as we see here, this would mean 120 gigawatts of small modular reactors. That's around 1,000 SMRs to be built by 2050. So a growing and bustling market with investment close to 700 billion cumulatively over the period. So we're very optimistic, but we're also at a point now where there are not commercial options readily available, but we are nearing the point when the first reactors will be commercially available and online. And we've also, since publishing the report, have seen the first SMR in advanced economies under construction in Canada, and an agreement to go ahead to build 4 of those SMRs in Canada. And that leads to the cost side. So I think to also frame expectations on the costs for both large and small modular reactors, we highlighted in the report, we spoke with the SMR companies and developers, with nuclear developers. We have checked and had these cost estimates. They are in line with, been reviewed and integrated and input from those companies of what the expectations are. There are promises of costs going lower than what's shown here, but we feel this is a good representative estimate from all the input and perspectives of what we should see in the marketplace if SMRs in particular are successful. Those first of a kind projects around 2030 will be significantly more expensive than large reactors. And here showing large reactors that are built on time and on budget. So again, not the few projects we've seen in the past that were delayed and over budget, but and this first SMR costs, we're seeing this first project in Canada is actually slightly above that starting point that we've shown here for SMRs. So the first projects in Canada, that first SMR will be above $10,000 per kilowatt, which then for a 1.2 gigawatt total project, which is 4 SMRs, will be well over $10 billion US. But we expect those costs to come down, and this series effect for small modular reactors there's an opportunity for those to come down much faster. And so we see there can be an advantage, even if the costs are slightly higher, again, with shorter time scales, that we see a healthy market for SMRs if they can get in the same cost range as large-scale reactors. And then the last slide before closing is I wanted to highlight, and I'm very happy to come back to this, so the construction cost is one aspect, but we should consider when we're thinking about sources of electricity, we need to think about their levelized cost of electricity, but also the value they bring to the electricity system. So in our reports, we combine those elements of costs, all the technology costs in the LCOE, or levelized cost of electricity, but also with the value propositions, how much energy they produce, the contributions to the reliability of power systems, and also flexibility contributions. And we combine those into something we call the VALCO, or value adjusted LCOE, which is shown here in the bars. And the dots are the levelized cost of electricity. Now here there's quite a bit already on screen, I'll add some more, is showing here just on the nuclear side and dispatchable clean technologies. One, we see lifetime extensions as one of the cheapest options for where existing reactors are aging. New large reactors, and here showing costs for China estimates in 2040. We see that a new large reactor would have a levelized cost between around $60 to up to $80 per megawatt hour. $60 to $70 per megawatt hour is the main range, where a new SMR might be slightly above that, maybe $60 to $80 per megawatt hour. But again, the speed at which, and also the sites in which SMRs can be built, can offer advantages, this is lower than the cost of hydropower or coal fitted with carbon capture. And if we compare this to solar and wind, then on the right, with and without storage, we can see that nuclear power, if we look at just the bars, nuclear power can be a competitive option compared with solar and wind, particularly with storage, especially if the financing costs for nuclear power can be kept low. And that's an important point in general, that nuclear power is very exposed to the financing costs because of the long construction periods, because of a very long lifetime. And so low-cost financing is one of the key factors to making sure nuclear power is affordable, which ultimately on the far right, you have the average costs of electricity generation. Ultimately, it's about affordability for consumers. And nuclear power can be one of those, an option that helps maintain the affordability of electricity for consumers as electricity demand grows, while maintaining the security of electricity throughout the year. And so I think I know there's a lot on this slide, but I wanted to bring that kind of analysis that we're doing, comparing different technologies, but very much with the mind to what the affordability, what the overall costs of electricity, and eventually the electricity prices are for consumers. So then to close, what we're seeing is we see a path to a new era of nuclear energy. We see that there are many opportunities and developments, and there are many prospects for nuclear power going forward because of policy support, because of the technology innovation, and because of overall an activity and an interest in secure and affordable energy. The industry must deliver projects on time and on budget. I think for nuclear power, this is especially important because of these long delays and cost overruns that we've seen in the past. Governments can play a very critical role, and we highlight this much more in the report, so I invite you also to look there, that there are many ways to help support and deliver this new era of nuclear energy. Those long-term policies and maintaining a consistent view on nuclear energy is very important for building up the industry and the supply chains, de-risking nuclear energy wherever possible to keep those financing costs low, moving forward and fostering innovation, so watching and keeping an eye on the latest technologies available, and ultimately making sure that the regulatory processes are thorough, complete, but also are streamlined, and have an eye to the technology and to delivering this affordable and reliable option amongst other options for electricity and heat as we go forward, where we need all options to meet growing demand. So I think I will end there, and very happy to have questions. If you'd like to ask questions again in the chat, very happy to have that, and I'll ask Søren and Philippe to take it from there.
Thanks, Brent. So I noticed quite a few questions about cost and schedule and comparing various sources of energy. We have one comment from Henri Payer from the IAEA saying it's true that it takes a longer time to build nuclear power plants than to build a wind farm or solar PV farm, but the scale of the capacity and amount of electricity that can be supplied is also of a different scale. So that's a topic that comes a lot on how do you compare different energy sources when they're a little bit like apple and pear. And so one question there is for Southeast Asia, given the abundance and cheap cost of fossil fuels, which can also serve as a base load similar to nuclear, why do we actually still need nuclear in this region? In a similar vein as well, how does nuclear compare to fossil fuel and renewable energy in terms of LCOE and VALCOE?
Thanks very much, Philippe, and thank you for the question, Henri. And we look very much forward also continuing this dialogue, also with collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency. I think this absolutely there are. So first, on the different characteristics of technologies, certainly the timelines are different, as noted. Also, the scale of projects can be different. There are increasingly very large projects also for solar and wind, which can, particularly for offshore wind, can be in the gigawatt scale. But most commonly, an onshore wind project would be somewhere between, would be 200 to 300 megawatts, would be a very common size. Solar projects are also in that size. Some are larger, many are smaller, towards 100 megawatts. And certainly a land availability is a key issue I would also bring there when we're comparing technologies. The resource availability is another question. So land and resource availability in Southeast Asia. We also have a Southeast Asia Energy Outlook every year. We're highlighting many of these issues, and it's every couple of years. Sorry, is this report where particularly we looked at the opportunities for wind power. There are less opportunities than in other parts of the world. The wind regime is, so the quality of the wind resource is a bit lower in Southeast Asia on average. Solar resources are fairly good, but land availability near population centers is not as abundant in some other parts of the world. So I think all of these characteristics certainly go into the choices. So if I kind of zoom again, focus on nuclear there, nuclear has some advantages, particularly compared with solar and wind, that it is a smaller site, less reliant on the resources surrounding, can be very large capacity, 1 gigawatt or more, and often the siting of reactors can be multiple large reactors on the same site. Or for small modular reactors, there are designs looking at having a dozen or 12 or more SMRs in the same place, so over a gigawatt on an individual site, and is not reliant on the quality of the resources nearby. And that can be quite an advantage. Compared with fossil fuels, I think this is an important point for Southeast Asia, is electricity demand is growing very rapidly. And so maintaining, while there are, of course, sources of coal and natural gas domestically, there is an increasing need or potential need for importing fossil fuels. So I think when the comparison is with imported coal or natural gas, then the costs look quite different. And then, so this is an opportunity where nuclear power and other low emission sources can help curb the demand or the increasing demand for fossil fuels, and can help make the best use of domestic resources and limit the need for increased imported fuels, which can be significantly more expensive. I think that's then also the comparisons on the LCOE and the value-adjusted LCOE side are quite important here. The value prospects for a nuclear project look quite similar to a coal or natural gas project. They produce energy around the clock. They are reliable, firm sources. And so the value prospects are the same. And so it becomes the comparison of the LCOE, the levelized cost alone, is a good indicator. And that, again, very much depends on the source of those fuels. If it is domestic source of coal or domestic source of natural gas, those can look very low cost, but imported natural gas or coal can look significantly more expensive. And so nuclear power amongst those, I would say, is going to look more expensive than domestic sources, but can look less expensive than imported sources. But there's a big, huge subject, so maybe I'll leave it there for now.
There are also quite a few questions about financing and the role of international financial institutions like the World Bank and ADB, and also the impact that their recent change in their stance on financing and funding nuclear, what the impact is that likely to have in nuclear in the region?
Absolutely. And in the report, we highlight and we dove deep to also, and to look at the sources of financing for what has been used successfully, so observations of past experience. Most financing for nuclear has been from public sources, very few from the private sector side. And this is something that we see would be very important to build out nuclear in line with the policies and plans, is to attract more private sector investment, but also more investment, enable or unlock more investment from international institutions like the World Bank, which, as noted, has changed its stance recently, and particularly highlighted the interest in financing lifetime extensions for nuclear reactors, and also an interest in supporting the development of small modular reactors. I think this is very positive. Our executive director, Dr. Fatih Birol, has been calling for greater activity from international financing institutions for many years now. And we're very happy to see these developments, because we need more sources of financing to make sure that the costs, again, of nuclear power are as low as they can be for consumers. And those financing costs really are very important for nuclear, given their long construction times and the long lifetimes as well. So this is quite a critical factor. So we see this as positive and can really facilitate delivering on those policies and plans, where I think financing can be a barrier that keeps away from that. So again, this is a way to move forward quite positively.
There are a few questions on technology. Where should Southeast Asia import nuclear technology? China and Russia are leading, but are there national security concerns for them to enter the region? What about Japan, Korea, and US tech companies in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think this is why I wanted to highlight this point of having that there's a more diverse set of technology providers than might first appear when looking at sort of recent projects. Or the last construction starts in the last 8 years have been dominated by Chinese and Russian designs. But again, there are technology providers and very prominent, large established companies developing nuclear power and have nuclear technology in the United States, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in Japan, in Korea. So I think each country needs to look at the available options in terms of the technology that fits their interests best, and also the partnerships that they are interested in developing. Because of the long lifetimes for nuclear power, a single reactor, its usual initial design lifetime is 40 to 50 years, but the anticipation is that most reactors will run 60 years or longer. And so the decision to engage with a technology provider is one that will also last many decades. So I think this is an important consideration in looking at nuclear energy and where the technology, where the interest is in which options to pursue. And again, there are a number of designs that are innovative designs that are coming forward in the next few years, particularly on the SMR side. So it's going to be a very active space in terms of competition for those designs that can be brought to market. And each will offer their own unique, each will offer some different benefits and characteristics. They will be different sizes. So we've seen anything from 80 megawatts or even some micro reactors that are 10 megawatts up to kind of a large SMR, which is just over 300 megawatts. So also what fits your system best can be a real question. I know that there's one option or one thing to consider is also using existing sites such as coal-fired power plants. If a coal-fired power plant is retired, it potentially can be used as a site for a small modular reactor. This is something that is being investigated heavily in advanced economies with many coal-fired power plants that have been retired in the past. And that kind of scale is something to also consider in this technology choice.
The most upvoted question is if you could talk about the waste management dimension. What are options and solutions for nuclear energy waste produced here in Southeast Asia?
So waste management, I think the first thing to say is that to date, nuclear waste produced from reactors have been stored either on site or been mainly stored on site. And there's two main ways. There's temporary storage within the cooling ponds on site, and this has been the standard. So this has been done for decades already, either in cooling ponds or in dry cask storage, which is essentially a small dry container that seals in the nuclear waste. These are, let's say, temporary, but can last for decades material. Then there is the longer term repositories that are now, and this has been a difficult question for the nuclear industry for many years. So it's very relevant to consider, but there are now under construction and approved for long-term subsurface or underground repositories in several countries around the world. So, and this is being investigated also. This has been progress in the last 5 years to actually move forward on that. We hope to see more options and more countries moving forward with long-term repositories for nuclear waste, because this can be significantly, we're talking about remaining a degree of radioactive for thousands of years. So this needs to be a very stable environment, one with very limited or no geologic activity. Has been a difficult topic, but we have seen a lot of progress on that just in the last 5 to 10 years that this is moving forward. So I think but it's worth keeping in mind that of the over 400 reactors operating today, the vast majority are storing the waste, which is a relatively small volume when we consider. I think it's one of the other advantages of nuclear power is it's a very extremely dense fuel, and that also means the waste in terms of kind of physical scale is quite small, and so it makes it more manageable than often is at first thought.
Yeah, and we plan to have a dedicated webinar that will touch on nuclear governance and on this topic in the coming couple of months. There are a few questions to do with geopolitics and ASEAN, and so I'll group them. So one is, do you think it's necessary for ASEAN to set their vision on jointly establishing a ASEAN nuclear ecosystem to serve regional energy security and nuclear and power ambition in the next 30 years? And do you think proliferation risks, particularly from the Middle East, would cause deployment delays in Southeast Asia? Is Southeast Asia relatively well insulated from these concerns?
Yeah, so I think this is also where, I think it's worth saying that, nuclear energy is sort of a different topic within the energy space because it does obviously touch on wider concerns. In terms of regulation and delivering nuclear development, within the region. I think there can be advantages to I think there are advantages and challenges with sort of focusing on a regional approach, and some of the advantages for having a regional approach to developing nuclear power can be that there are, particularly for standardizing designs and design approval. So one thing we've seen from experience in Europe in particular is that designs have to be approved at the country level. And so the design approval process can be quite significant. In many cases, this is a process that can take easily 5 years, but can extend longer than that. And we've seen the same. The United States has its own design approval process. So one thing we're seeing now is a targeted activity in Europe on SMR designs to think more regionally about approving SMR designs at a regional level, which is, the complexity of that is higher, is getting agreement from many countries at once on the design. So the process will be longer, but ultimately that could be very beneficial for scaling up, to make it more of a technology that can be, let's say, copy and pasted and built many times over. So that can also be an advantage in Southeast Asia from the start, if there's a collective process on the design approval and overall regulatory process. In the end, the regulatory and safety needs to make sure that it is independent, verified, and present in every country that has nuclear power. And so that is very much a process to be considered, certainly at the country level. But yeah, I think a combination here, not everything at the regional level, and there would be benefits, though, if everything is not at the country level either. And I think this point on that the nuclear power aspects, I think as we're seeing geopolitics and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, I think it's technically, there's also a very important point here that the nuclear fuel used in a power plant, in a reactor, is a much lower level of enrichment than in any kind of weapon. So they are quite different things, and there is a significant gap between the two. And so I think that this non-proliferation is an important concept that's been a part of the nuclear power industry and regulatory concern for many decades, and managed well. I think can be managed also in Southeast Asia.
So we've got 1 minute left, so I'll give you the last question, and I'll try to group two together. One is from our colleague Simon. Why would you build 1 gigawatt of SMR versus 1 gigawatt of traditional nuclear? The potential of SMR to decarbonize sectors. And then if you had to summarize maybe the real barriers to nuclear deployment in Southeast Asia, what would be like the top 1 or 2 or 3 issues that should be prioritized?
Okay, good. Hard-hitting questions. So 1 gigawatt of SMR versus 1 gigawatt of large reactors. I think there can be, this is assuming that they're commercially available, so it's moved forward a few years. But some of the advantages for building 1 gigawatt eventually of SMRs is that they would come in smaller steps. So, for example, this project in Canada, which is exactly planning to do this, to build 4 300 megawatt reactors, so totaling 1.2 gigawatts. The first of those SMRs will be completed, while the second is under construction, and the third and the fourth. Now that offers a gain of learning, that the costs of the successive units will be significantly lower than the first unit. So there can be then also a series effect for the next gigawatt. So maybe if you were just building 1 gigawatt, it would be a very difficult argument. But if you're building more than 1 gigawatt, there could be a very significant advantage just following that. The other is the siting side. I mean, this is 1 gigawatt of SMRs could be 4 reactors in one place, or it could be 4 reactors in different sites. And that can give some flexibility on using existing energy sites, repurposing them. There's also the financing angle of how large a single investment decision is. So for a large reactor, as I mentioned, can be 2 to 10 billion euros, or 2 to 10 billion dollars, where again these decision points are much smaller, or would be a smaller amount for SMRs for each unit. So the total may be the same or even slightly higher, but also in smaller bites can be easier to handle on the financing side. And then if I think the real barriers to close here, and we're 1 or 2 minutes over, the topmost barrier we've seen elsewhere, so it's from experience, is having continued commitment to develop nuclear energy. If we're in 2050 and looking back, a successful development of nuclear energy in Southeast Asia will mean that there had been continuous engagement and agreement and commitment to build out nuclear. If this wavers, then it's very difficult for the nuclear industry to move forward. We've seen this in a number of countries where that slows down progress, often by decades. So that commitment is a real barrier, because that's decades of commitment on a technology is not an easy thing, which links to a second major barrier or potential barrier, is making sure that the public is fully engaged and accepts and is supportive of nuclear power, which is also a topic that will be covered in other dialogue series. But that public commitment and public engagement is really important to continue and to enable that commitment. And I think maybe a third real barrier is developing those, gaining experience in the supply chains and actually having the experience building out nuclear reactors. These can be long processes and require a significant amount, let's say, of patience and, again, commitment that can be a bit more of a challenge than other technologies. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent. So please keep an eye out for future webinars in the series in the coming weeks on nuclear governance, community acceptance, and how to build a supply chain and more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you very much, everyone.